If anyone's watching on the recording, I just played a clip of from The Lion King to get at the dynamics of temptation. This is when Uncle Scar tempts Simba to go to the elephant graveyard. So that's what we're talking about. Because obviously there's some really interesting parallels to how the serpent tempts Eve and Adam.
Hey, Uncle Scar, guess what?
I despise guessing games.
I'm gonna be king of Pride Rock.
Oh, goody.
My dad just showed me the whole kingdom, and I'm gonna rule it all.
Yes. Well, forgive me for not leaping for joy. Bad back, you know.
Hey, Uncle Scar, when I'm king, what'll that make you?
A monkey's uncle.
You're so weird.
You have no idea. So, your father showed you the whole kingdom, did he?
Everything.
He didn't show you what's beyond that rise at the northern border.
Well, no. He said I can't go there.
And he's absolutely right. It's far too dangerous. Only the bravest lions go there.
Well, I'm brave. What's out there?
I'm sorry, Simba. I just can't tell you.
Why not?
Simba, I'm only looking out for the well-being of my favorite nephew.
Yeah, right. I'm your only nephew.
All the more reason for me to be protective. An elephant graveyard is no place for a young prince. Oops.
An elephant what? Whoa.
Oh, dear, I've said too much. Well, I suppose you'd have found out sooner or later. You being so clever and all. Oh, just do me one favor. Promise me you'll never visit that dreadful place.
No problem.
There's a good lad. You run along now and have fun. And remember, it's our little secret.
Only the bravest go to this area. Like, right, the implication, of course, that Simba would have taken is
Right.
like, oh, well, I think I'm brave, so I should go. But Simba wouldn't necessarily have perceived that as Scar telling him, even though that was sort of Scar's intention. So that sort of like manipulation is really interesting in light of what Sonia shared.
I forgot to mention like secret keeping is another aspect of that, getting them to keep a secret about anything.
Yes, yes. Scar gets Simba to keep a secret that they had this conversation and that now he wants to go there. The deeper secret is the doubt, right? Like that Simba now distrusts his father, like or believes somehow that his father, King Mufasa, doesn't really know him. But if he really knew me and really knew how brave and courageous and strong I am, like it would be no problem, right? So, okay. So life is just simpler to not tell dad.
You're gonna get something out of this that your dad he didn't tell you about, or he's hiding from you in some way, or this is greater than what he let be known to you.
Yeah. Yeah. There's something in it for you, and they're not letting you know this yet. But I think you're ready for this. So there's this waiting period, right? Like Simba had to grow up. There's this thing. He would be king. He one day would be strong enough, and you know it would be appropriate to go there if he needed to. But he is impatient for something, and he's impatient for that day. That change in himself, and the temptation plays on his impatience. So something that is rightfully his and would be his in time that is like what is being offered now. All right. Really good. So let's dive in here to this passage. Obviously, well, so we'll take it in chunks. Well, let's work with Genesis 3 verses 1 through 7 first. How does the temptation work here? What's similar? What's different?
Should we define what the serpent it says? The serpent was more cunning than all the animals the Lord God made on the earth. So he kind of sly in a way. I don't know. And like a serpent, like when I think of a serpent, I think of all the other places in the Bible that it talk about. It's like a spiritual being, or like a guardian of a guardian of the throne or something, or a guardian of the king's throne, and like it's like a theomorphic kind of being. It's like man and animal, and he's supposed to be there guarding something. He's supposed to be there, but he's is the means by which he's given supposedly divine information. Like when you look at other cultures and they talk about a serpent or something, a serpent normally is the means to which you get divine information. He not really guarding. He not guarding. He's tempting. You know.
Yes, yes. In verse 1, the serpent is craftier or more sly than any beast of the field. So it is grouped in with other animals, right?
Yeah.
So from Adam and Eve's point of view, this thing is something we know or is under us, right?
Because they named it, right?
Presumably, yeah.
Yeah.
And they're not afraid of it at first. So,
And then he sows doubt, like in the Simba thing, he sows doubt. Has God indeed said? What did God really say?
mhm.
You shall not eat from every tree of the garden. But is that what he said?
It's not what he said.
Yes, I mean the serpent exaggerates way out in left field, right? And then Eve feels like you're being ridiculous. I'm going to defend God's good name. But before we go farther, what name for God has the narrator used, and what name for God does the serpent use? Why does that matter?
Like Rachel said, they don't use the Lord God. The narrator does, but the serpent doesn't. Like Rachel just put in the chat.
Yes, and does that matter? The word or the phrase for the Lord God is Yahweh Elohim. So two things about that. One is it's definitely the covenant name for God. Like when God is stressing the relationship of covenant that he has with his people, including Adam and Eve in the beginning, that's the name he uses, or that's the name the narrator uses, right? So somehow Yahweh Elohim is relational. Yahweh, it's difficult to understand exactly what is going on with the name, which is called the tetragrammaton, YHWH. But one theory is Yahweh is like the sound that you make when you breathe. And that would be appropriate given in Genesis 2, how did God, well, God breathed into Adam, right? And presumably he fashioned Eve's body and then breathed into Eve, because I cannot imagine that God made Eve endure the formation of her own body. That would be absurd. So the idea is that, okay, if God breathes into us, and then his name, his relational covenant name, also reminds me of breathing, of my breath. And this is the God who is closer to me than my very breath, right? He is actually present in me. Like he's giving me life right now through breathing. So there's an intimacy connected to this name, but the translation for God, the name God is Elohim, which is, it appears to be more functional, right? So in Genesis 1, that's the name of God used. Elohim created the heavens and the earth. And then you have all this, the power. So maybe like it could mean the God of powers. And maybe that has something to do with the fact that it's plural. Hard to say. But in any case, it's not as intimate as the covenant name of God. So far, so good. This is a big deal. And let me underscore something, which is after I don't know, in the 1800s leading up to World War II, there were a lot of German scholars who said, aha, two names for God, two different sources. And it's like the US Constitution, right? You had different schools of thought in Israel, like free states and slave states, except they had different names for God, and this is one of those things. And it made totally no sense. But this is that is what passed for scholarship. Why do I say that? Because it is clear what is going on here with the serpent. The serpent gets Eve to use the distant name for God, not the covenantal name for God. Why? Because he wants Eve to act on her own. He doesn't want her to be reminded that God is present. Like, I could go ask him some questions. If I'm unclear about anything, I could say, wait a second, God is near, right? So this whole business of, well, different names for God indicate different schools of thought, and the Bible was stitched together as a political compromise. It's a very weak argument. Yes, that's what's called, Chandler. It's what's called the documentary hypothesis. So really key. And so Eve starts to defend God, the God of all powers. She defends him. Talk to me about that.
Well, I just have a question, because I've also heard in like the Bible Project stuff like that, that Elohim can also just mean like all spiritual beings, or like can be used like, I don't know if I'm misremembering that, but that was something that like that I was wondering about, like if like is it used only like, you know, just I don't know, you could refresh me on that, but like you know, like when it's God's plural, does that include like angels with that, because it could be spiritual beings or the actions of angels on behalf of God?
It can, Sonia, and it depends on context. It can even include us. So in Psalm 82, the psalmist says, "You shall be gods," speaking to the leaders of Israel, because gods is technically a job description. It's not a personal name. Just like Satan is a job description. It's not a personal name. It means the accuser. So so then in John 10, Jesus quotes Psalm 82 because the Pharisees are like, "Hey, you making yourself equal to God." And then he makes fun of this and says like, "Well, I mean in the Psalms it says you shall be gods. You shall be, meaning you will be judges." Uh and and they're like, we don't know what to say. So yes, it can mean other beings, but it again is somewhat context dependent. Here in um, Genesis 1 and 3, I'm taking it to mean just God. Verse 2, right? The woman said to the serpent, "From the fruit of the trees of the garden we may eat, but from the fruit of the tree which is in the middle of the garden, God has said," God, right? Elohim has said, "You shall not eat from it or touch it, or you will die." What are all the things you notice about that?
Mirroring some of what the serpent has suggested, but not all of it. She's mirroring the way that he's referring to God, and she's coming a little bit towards him from what the command actually stated, which is just don't eat it. God didn't say anything about touching it.
Yes. So somehow she adds this touching bit to it, which we'll get to in just a second. She actually blunts God's generosity, right? So when she says, "From the fruit of the trees of the garden we may eat," yeah, technically true, but the way God said it back in Genesis 2 was, "Look at the trees, eating you will eat." That's the grammatical construction for emphasis, right? Like the infinitive future. Eating you will eat, dying you will die. Eating you will eat. So this is like, boom, all of this stuff, and you will do it, and it is good. Here it's once, right? We may eat. So already in her mind, she is starting to blunt God's generosity, or maybe just take for granted all the trees. So that's one.
I think what was interesting is in Genesis 2, my other thought is that God's commandment was technically given to Adam.
Hmm.
And here the serpent is questioning Eve. But like Adam's also supposedly next to her and stays silent. So that's sort of an interesting dynamic.
Yes. Yes. And so when scripture, one of the things we're supposed to ask is like, who got it wrong exactly? Did Adam tell her something? Like, did he add the don't touch it either? Right? Because that by itself causes problems, right? Because when she does touch it and she doesn't die, at least recognizably, um, it starts to discredit God, right? So there's a brief window of time in which she could be like, "Hey, um, I didn't die. Maybe I should talk to God about this." She doesn't do that because something has been discredited in her. It is sown in distrust, right? And so it's in that framework of distrust that she then says, "Well, maybe I could eat it." Because if he lied, if this is untrue, this stuff about touching, then maybe the stuff about eating doesn't matter either. Did anyone grow up with, I don't know, like teachings from your church or parents that made God out to be more strict than he really is? So as an example, some traditions say don't drink any alcohol whatsoever. Now, my understanding is that in Ephesians 5, God says, or scripture says, do not get drunk. But drinking alcohol is, there's a window before, and you could do it before you get drunk. Am I making sense? And yet, if we were to say just in toto, like don't drink any alcohol, people would take a few sips of alcohol and say, what's the problem here? Right? Like, why? I don't understand. And then it starts to discredit the real limits. So, right, drunkenness actually impairs your speech, your thinking, your sense of responsibility. For men, it makes men interpret women as being more sexually interested in them than they actually are. I mean, there's all kinds of things. So there are good reasons to not get drunk, but that's called there's a Jewish phrase for it called hedging the Torah, right? Where you build a fence further out from the actual boundary so that like people won't do it. But there are some real dangers with that.
I feel like not only was I taught hedges around the law, but I was taught that hedges around the law as a concept is good, and it's even more faithful than just not doing the thing. Like, what would be even more pleasing to God than not touching that? What would be even more like, if God likes you to not touch it, then God must really like it if you stayed 10 feet away from it, or 20. And like, there's no end
Oh
to
my.
how far you can take that.
Right.
And
Yeah,
it gets applied like in terms of gender friendships between the sexes. It's like, if God doesn't want you to do an adultery, then what would really please God is if you just never interacted with any woman not your wife.
Right. Right.
that's so funny you say that, Rachel, because that was going to be my church growing up example where there was a long discussion about like if we should even be friends with people from the opposite gender.
Or like having a supervisor of or mentor of the opposite gender, right? It's like, or a mentee where, well, I mean, their development then now depends on or is limited, right? Because you're not going to mentor them. Yeah. Thanks, Jeremy. Sexualizing all relationships between men and women. Yeah.
Like I think about dysfunctional families and how that sort of rule of like, well, if you piss mom off or dad off by doing this, well, then why don't you make sure that you don't even get close to doing that? And then if you slap religion on top of that because you're running away from something dysfunctional, then that makes it like even more powerful.
Thanks. Yes.
I was just thinking too, like the difference between like teaching a like obey me because I said versus teaching like wisdom about the thing and teaching the person to be able to be like, yeah, you know, you do need to be mindful of like being in certain situations, and like here's some wisdom of tools to like help you operate in that and not get harmed. And like here's some safe areas for you to practice that wisdom.
Yeah.
You know, so like I wonder too when I read this, like you know, with God making it a rule, because rule, like, you know, kids have to test boundaries, right? So like I know like some people suggest like, okay, was it like a natural boundary testing thing of wisdom, like because they were, you know, moral infants, like Adam and Eve, moral infants, you know, was it an, you know, was it somewhat, I've heard that before. But I think the other thing that I wonder too is that like you know, uh like, you know, did God, like being relational when he said it, hope that they would relationally check in and, you know, begin to ask him about why he made the rule rather than just being like, I don't know, however they decided to receive it.
Yes. So wisdom as related to our development, right? Like this is important because of who you are. In this case, God made us a certain way, and so it's important. He knows something. And then there's the possibility of a check-in.
Another thing that I have ran across about this is that God just didn't want Eve to have wisdom, period, at all. I have a book on my shelf that I keep for research that is kind of the premise of the whole thing, is like feminism is like Eve trying to be wise, but God didn't want her to be wise. He just wanted her to be a follower. And it's so against the grain of everything else the Bible says about wisdom. Like, wisdom is good. We have entire books of the Bible about that. Proverbs, James, Ecclesiastes, like they're all about wisdom is good, actually. But there were two different, like there's only two places you can go to look for wisdom, and it's God or something created. And so it wasn't that God didn't want her to have wisdom. It was that he wanted Adam and Eve to approach him, to be taught, to be discipled, rather than trying to figure it all out from what they saw in nature.
Right. It is so important to see that starting from Genesis 2, there was a path of growth and development that God intended for Adam and Eve and all human beings. So, you know, that's kind of obvious now because we start as infants and we grow, right? We have the experience of growing, even just bodily, and even getting to know our own bodies, learning what our capabilities are. Like that's having our taste buds change over time. Like those kinds of things are learning experiences for us. And I that's one of the things I really like about the Lion King clip, because you see Simba in a state of boyhood and he wants something. He wants to be at the kind of at the mature at his mature phase, but he's not there yet. And is there something similar going on, right, with Adam and Eve?
I mean, and even if you look at the previous chapter or two, I mean, where human beings are supposed to be the images of God, like they're supposed to rule over creation on his behalf. Like, don't you like, because I've heard like not what Rachel was saying that people have written about women, but you also hear people like, oh, well, God just didn't want humans at all, like maybe from like atheists or thinking or something, like God was holding back humans from knowledge and wisdom. And yeah, it's like, no, well, they needed to have the knowledge of good and evil to actually be images of God and be his representatives and rule over creation in a good way on his behalf. So they were going to have knowledge of good and evil. It's just, do you want to take that shortcut? Or like, do you want to figure out like, oh, it's my own, I get to define good and evil, or do you want to walk with God and grow toward knowledge of good and evil, according to your relationship with him?
Bingo. Yeah. Thanks, Ian. So good. I mean, there's so much texture to this. Definitely the whole thing of making wider fences and hedging and hedging and hedging and hedging, like it just discredits God. So don't do it. Okay. One more thing before we move on. to verse 4, which tree was actually in the middle of the garden? Look back at chapter 2. Yes, Chandler. Tree of life. Tree of life, that's in the middle. What? So why does she say the tree of the knowledge of good and evil is in the middle of the garden? What does that mean about her perspective?
It's in the forefront of her mind, maybe.
Yes, Josh. Her mental map has redrawn the garden so that what is at the center of the garden is the restriction. Originally, the way God drew the garden was the center is the life, the tree of life. Because again, and thanks for the shout out, Chandler. The the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, where is it? We don't know. I mean, it's somewhere. And I think I mentioned the Syriac Christian tradition, which pictures a mountain.
I was actually just going to ask what Jerry mentioned about the NIV translation.
NIV is frustrating. They're carrying over a verb of like there was. We don't know where the tree of knowledge is. It's not in the middle. And in any case, the tree of life is in the middle. Like that's how it's introduced. The mental map of Eve at this point is God is not as generous as I thought before. The restrictions are at the center of God's plan, right? Not the life giving. Whereas before, his law giving served his life giving. Like, why are there boundaries in life? To serve our growth and our life, our wisdom and our ability to be more godly, and to bear God's image and to bear his likeness, all and to take in more of his life. But somehow now in the center for Eve is, God is holding out. He's not that generous, and he's holding out on us. And he's more restrictive than he actually is, right? Like that. That's not what she's saying to herself, but like that's what we observe about her. So she thinks he's more restrictive than he actually is, and now she has set herself up to discredit God. So she's going to touch the fruit and not die, and it's like, well, who can I trust now? Okay, so verse 4, the serpent said to the woman, you surely will not die. For God knows that in the day you eat from it, your eyes will be opened and you will be like God, knowing good and evil. Is it wrong to want to be like God?
Someone said something about like the timing and the patience
Yeah.
of like slowly building up character and like doing things the right way. That seems to be at play here, especially with like the way he talks about it. It's so urgent. It's like this, and then a switch comes on, versus it being not a restriction, but like, don't do this. I'm gonna build your character, or I'm gonna teach you my ways. That's how I'm seeing it, which is a lot harder, slower, no shortcuts.
One thing that's helped me understand what's going on here is in paralleling it with Proverbs. And in Proverbs, you have two women, you have wisdom and folly, and wisdom is calling out and folly is calling out. And they're saying a lot of the same things. Like they're offering a lot of the same goods. But wisdom is saying, like, come to my house. I have made a banquet. You're invited. It doesn't cost anything. And folly is like, what would be cool is if you're hungry, you should go steal stuff. So it's not that the food is bad or that it's bad to be hungry. It's that you are being offered something that somebody has the right to give you, and you could take it freely, but instead you would rather sneak around and take it without their permission.
Right. I'm going to go to the elephant graveyard, right? Like
Exactly.
I mean, you can go, you can talk to your dad and maybe he'll take you to the elephant graveyard while you're little, or maybe you'll just have to wait till you're a little older and bigger, and maybe you wouldn't risk Nala's life too, right? There's so much there. So something is there, and we're supposed to interact with it in the appropriate way, but somehow Satan's lie, the serpent's lie, gets us to disorder the the proper relationship we should have with it, to try to take on things by themselves, right? I'm sure at this point, because Eve is speaking of God in the word Elohim, and not Yahweh Elohim, she's thinking, uh, you know, I'm sitting here defending God. Like, I'm doing a great job because God needs defenders like me. It's not wrong to be like God. God had wanted the fruits of apologetics. Yes, we need to be really careful because yeah, I mean, even apologetics can be this thing that we do without God, or without being in his presence first. So we argue about God. This is really amazing. I because temptation happens like this all the time. Really, God designed the world dripping with his generosity, but it has to be, we have to receive it in the right way and with the right spirit and in the right order. Like, these things can become very disordered for us. And so it's very easy to focus on the thing that seems out of our reach at the moment. It's someone else's personality, right? Or someone else's money, or someone else's friends, or someone else's success, or someone else's significant other, or someone else's gifts, or whatever. It seems like that's the thing I don't have right now, and I want it right now. And that's even and so it pushes into the coveting space. And yet that is the serpent's hiss. It's also really interesting to think about this from the standpoint of, you know, only God can create. Like, the serpent or Satan can't create anything. All he can do is lie and twist your perception about how you relate to other things. I just want you to note how the theme of sight comes up in verses 5, 6, and 7, when she saw, and that, her eye, it was pleasing to the eye. So this is what begins the dynamic between hearing by faith, or by hearing God and receiving it by faith, versus looking at something and saying, I can see that this is a fruit tree and it looks just like the other fruit trees. So I'm going to conclude that there is no difference. The only thing that is different about the tree of the knowledge of good and evil is the fact that God said, don't eat that one. Right. So it's that his word so far up to this point has shaped their thinking and interpretation about reality. Now they are discarding what he said and just using their eyes, and they are and saying, this looks just the same. I think this is the beginning of the faith versus sight, or hearing versus sight, right? And if you continue that with that, you could run into all kinds of problems, right? And so what is slavery but looking at a person and saying, I'm not going to treat you as human, I'm going to treat you like a cattle, like that's where chattel comes from, and because it's how I see you, and I'm not going to listen to how God speaks about you. I'm going to just judge with my eyes. I'm going to judge with my eyes that there is no such thing as adultery, because there's no real difference between my spouse's body and anyone else's body. I'm judging reality with my eyes. I'm not listening to God about this. Does that make sense? So that's kind of how this whole theme begins. Did Adam tell Eve? I know I'm using anachronistic names. Uh, hey, don't touch that either. We don't know, and so often when Scripture does this, um, it is trying to encourage us to think through both possibilities. Does that make sense? So, like, maybe it was just her, maybe it was him. Either way, like, none of them, neither of them like checked in with God. Hey, God, is this the understanding? Or neither checked in with each other. Is this what God originally said? So it's a big disappointment from that standpoint. So they fall, and what are the consequences? I think I interpreted the tree of knowledge of good and evil a bit last time, but just as a refresher, when they eat from it, I think what they're doing is they're saying, I want the power to define good and evil in myself. Trees are like God. What is a tree if you don't have power tools? It's bigger than you. It looks like it's been around longer than you. It's stronger than you, and it gives you life without dying itself, right? Like that's a tree. Okay, so trees are like God. God gives me. God has life, and God has law, and he wants me to participate more deeply in his life, and he wants me to let him be the lawgiver, right? So it's like, leave that one alone. Put your back to the tree of the knowledge of good and evil in trust, not in defiance, in trust. Look at the tree of life. That's where it's going, because God's law giving serves as life giving. There. And so to turn around and to take this in means they start to define good and evil for themselves from within themselves, and in a very selfish way. So we'll see that in Genesis 3 and 4. What else do we see? What does that corruption of sin do to them?
Verse 7 uses the language of eyes again. Their eyes were opened, and then they knew they were naked. And then there's a bunch of shame and all that attached to all that.
Yes. I mean, but it's weird, right? Because they were naked before. They surely they understood something about that. So what does it mean to all of a sudden realize, like, all this time I've been naked? Dang.
Well, Augustine had a really interesting answer.
Oh, what did he say, Rachel?
Oh, just something along the lines of like them being suddenly seized with lust. Or I might be thinking of Milton. Or it might be Milton inspired by Augustine.
Yeah, that tradition goes a long way back in Western Christianity.
It almost seems like they're like adjacent to shame. They're self-conscious.
Mm-hmm.
Like I don't know if this is like totally accurate, but like not just of the fact that they are naked, but I think there's almost this acknowledgement that's wrapped up in what they know they did, that it's wrong. Kind of like um the way that like a kid reacts when they did something they're not supposed to and they know it, and like the sort of after effects of that behavior.
Eyes desire all over the lust of the eyes. I mean, it's possible it was lopsided. I could believe that male lust kind of kicks in here, but I think it's more that they were aware that look, we were supposed to be fruitful and multiply, and now I'm not sure if I trust you. So I'm going to hide the places in me that are different from you. I'm going to put a barrier up between the thing that we're supposed to partner in, right? We're supposed to be intimate. I'm not sure how I feel about that anymore. So it's saying, I think it's more, I'm not sure I trust you, right? I don't trust you. Uh, like this is a vulnerable part of myself, and this is about our partnership. I'm not sure where that's at right now. So I know we can entertain different theories.
Just the theme of looking, all the looking, like looked at the fruit, look like with this desire, this lustful looking at the fruit, and then now they're seeing that they're naked. A lot of like bringing up like what they're seeing and looking at.
They're dominated by the seeing, right? Not the hearing anymore. Rather than having their vision participating in God's seeing of the truth of things in relational transparency, their vision is now self-absorbed, turned in on themselves, non-participatory, and alienated. Yes, Ephesians 4:17 through 19. Yeah. and then they grow more and more distant. It's hard to know what these differences, what are we supposed to do with the fact that we're so different? Like, I'm not sure I trust you anymore. Like, I see these things and I'm scared. So why do you think God asks questions? Doesn't he know the answers already? How do you think God should have responded? Jeremy says God asks questions to open up space for us, for our discernment. There's kind of an invitation, right? From questions are an invitation. Please step back into this relationship, right? And then I'm going to ask you again, because God waited for Adam to wake up and know his need. Like, God asks questions to sear right through the illusions that we put up, and we have to do the self-assessment. Where am I? Why am I hiding from a God who can't see through like tree leaves?
Just as serpent led them into the lie, he perhaps is leading them back to the truth.
That's deeply relational.
It also seems like the questions are asked to emphasize the breakdown in the relationship between man and woman. Like, to your point, Mako, right at the start, they like go in on the sin together. They like both eat from the fruit. In theory, they're like on the same page. And then this like distrust between the two happens when they realize they're naked, and then God is asking them these questions and they immediately start to like blame each other,
Right.
and rather than sort of both being like, we own up to this, like we did this together. It was like, oh, this other person got me to do this.
One thing that it is striking to me is his response, God's response.
Mhm.
What's missing, like, because it could have easily looked like maybe what we see in other people, or like, for example, like a really harsh rebuke, like, look what you did, or I don't know. There's a million ways it could have gone, but the way the scriptures points it out, the way God responds is very I don't know. It's not the way I envision most people who give a command to people and they are disobeyed, like how they respond. So
Right. I mean, if this were a Greek creation story, Zeus might be throwing thunderbolts, like killing people. Like, can't believe it. You're bothering me. But here, like, God pursues, he comes out, he pursues them, he asks questions, he waits for their response.
Right. There's a way in which God is still desiring their participation, right? Because I think God knows their motivation, so he could just accuse them and just kind of lay all the truth out there, right, in front of them, like sort of just expose it all and just,
Right.
I think that would bypass the whole point of God's desire to have our participation in the truth, repairing what we've done wrong.
Right.
So there's a desire for in asking the question, he's also, it's the most reparative and restorative way to approach them too.
Yep.
Giving the opportunity for taking responsibility. Right.
Right. I love that. Thank you, Jeremy. Participation in truth telling. Like, he still wants it. He could have said, I know exactly what you did. I was just around the corner. Or I know it all. Or I can see right through your thoughts. He doesn't do that. He's like, I would like your participation in the truth telling. This is restorative justice. There's other things about restorative justice, divine restorative justice, that come through in this chapter too, but it is not retributive. We have to be mindful, right? Another thing that sin causes, that then by contrast, Adam shifts the blame over to Eve. And so he demonstrates that he is not at least at first, wanting to participate. And even they could have participated together and confessed together, but Adam does not do that. So, this woman you gave me, throws her under the bus. The spirit of it is certainly like separation from, I am drawing back from you. And so, and I have nothing but accusation, sin and blame shifting.
I also see like that he's blaming God because God gave him the woman. So he's like even taking the shade all the way back to, well, you gave me her, so it's your fault for giving
Yeah.
me a bad partner. And and so like and then God on the flip goes in the other order.
Yeah.
Like when he goes through the curses, like, like because he says you gave it to me, and then the woman, and then the serpent, and then God untwists it in that same reverse order.
Right. Yeah. Thanks, Sonia. So good.
I was gonna also mention something off of what Haley put in the chat about the therapy people feeling like they can't read their mind. It was I've been like reading this book, A Whole Brain Child, and they talk a lot about like with children and like developmentally appropriate things to do, like how important it is to have them tell the narrative of whatever happened that was like kind of a shocking event, because they need to do that in order to process it. And so like just to have them like continuously, because otherwise if you don't, that's when you like for like especially like really really young children, like okay, some accident happens in the pool, and then later on they don't even realize why they're afraid of water when they're older, like they just don't even like they don't even know why.
Yeah.
And like that a lot of those like little things like that happen is because they didn't narrate what happened when they were younger. And so like a preventative measure for like when something kind of scary happens is to have that child like narrate through the scary thing that happened, so that later they're not plagued by this fear they can't even place because it was so young they can't even remember why.
Right. It's just some association. So is God punishing them now? To the end of verse 19.
I feel like punishment isn't a really good category for what's going on. Like punishment would be them dying right away.
Oh, good point, Rachel. I mean, many people use the word punishment to describe what happens in the next few verses. So why don't you feel like it's the best description?
I feel like as much as you can call things natural logical consequences in relation to God, who is sovereign, and you can't really use those terms exactly the same way in relation to God. But from our perspective, it is very much just the natural consequences of the choice. And God has set up human choices so that when you make this choice, this happens. And when you make that choice, something not so good happens. And God is allowing them to experience natural consequences, which is actually a mark of esteem in a way, that he allows their choices to actually make an impact in the world. But he allows it to make it a real impact and for them to experience real consequences while also preserving them. So the words of cursing have a preserving element to them, even in the midst of this is how things are going to be. The ground is cursed, but you still will be able to get food from it. You'll still be able to have children. Human life is going to go on, and there's a redemption in the future. So it's like the best of all possible worlds, that he's not just like, whatever choice you make, it's all gonna, it doesn't matter. Your choices are just nothing. But he's still not allowing them to fall as far as they could fall.
Into like total self-destruction or something like that. Yeah. Yeah. Well, we'll have to see Cain's story to get a little closer to that. I'm gonna cut to the chase because of time. So I'm sorry for this, but the reason God exiles Adam and Eve is the question we need to answer first. And I think the consequences on the serpent, Adam, Eve are anticipating the exile, right? So why does God exile? How is that? Well, first of all, why does God exile Eve and Adam from the garden? It's so they don't eat from the tree of life while in a corrupted state. So that because then that they would make human sin and corruption immortal along with themselves, and that is the worst possible outcome. So even exile is mercy. Exile is, and human mortality begins there also, and but it's one part of God's restorative justice, because Jesus will come, he will restore human nature, he will undo the sin behind the mortality and offer it to us. But that's going to take a long time. So for now, exile is the consequence. But being at a remove from the garden, in some sense, being at a remove from God as a life source, means that all of the life producing, the life bearing, is going to be harder. So we are still gardeners. We still are, God still calls us to be producing garden life and human life. So that's amazing, because he doesn't just scratch the job description out and, like ball it up and throw it away. We still have the job. We're still on the job. God says, well, it's going to be harder, but I I want you to do the thing that I've called you to do. I still want to partner with you. And now what's really amazing is that the seed of the woman will come through you. It will come through like your obedience now and your faithfulness in that sense. So redemption will come by partnering with me. I think that's the proper way to interpret the consequences on Eve and then Adam. Yeah, you don't want an immortal abuser. So even these consequences are restorative. Even the fact that God keeps our job description intact, it's restorative. He still wants our participation. That's pretty, and redemption, the seed of the champion who will come and crush the head of the serpent comes through our participation. Just to close, I want to hit a few details of verses 20 to 24. When Adam names Eve Eve, I think it's an act of both love for her and trust in God. Right? Because to call her the life bearer is to say, I believe in this promise that God just said, right? Like, so our marriage is back if it ever fell apart. And I recognize like the truth about what God is going to do through you. So you are the life bearer. And so he reunites with her and expresses that in hope and trust. The flaming sword is the way back to the garden. So the cherubim, the next time this appears in scripture is on the lid of the Ark of the Covenant, right? And God is the flaming sword between the two cherubim. He stands at the threshold of the garden and says, behind me, like this is as far as you can come. Behind me is the garden. At some point, you will be able to come again, and I'll be able to reunite heaven and earth. Remember in Genesis 2:4, what is this genealogy of? Of humanity? No, it's the genealogy of the heavens and the earth. Why are heaven and earth disjointed like this? They could have overlapped and increased in that overlap. Remember how water and heaven are in Hebrew are semantically related, like mayim and shamayim, water and heaven, very, very tightly identified. But now they're disrupted. We are disrupted. We're corrupted by, we should be at home in the garden and spreading it and bestowing an inheritance to our children and their children. Instead, we are not. We have to labor in a fallen world, and we give birth to fallen children. So everything we do is ambiguous, but the way back is there's an invitation there, and there's a signal that God is saying, I want you to come back, but I'm going to have to cut away and burn away something in you that should not be there. Before I let you back, I have to deal with that, and it's going to be through partnership. So these themes of the sword and the fire sometimes come together. We'll watch for it in the Old Testament. It will come back together finally in Jesus in Revelation chapter 1, where he is on fire, like he is the one who has purified his humanity so that he glows with fire, and he has the sword of his word coming out of his mouth. He is the one who burns away and cuts away the corruption of sin so that he could take us home, and so that he could reunite the garden again with this planet. So thematically, we have to see that fire begins restoratively, right? It's not retributive. It's for purification and restoration and healing and burning away something, the dross from the gold, like in us. It is not like, hey, I'm just threatening you here. So I hope that is it tantalizing. Blessings to you. Have a great week.